Imagine sitting in a pitch-black parlor room. It's 1899. Across the table, a 15-year-old girl's muscles suddenly freeze solid.
Right, she just sinks into her chair, turning deathly pale.
Yeah. And when she finally opens her mouth, it's not a teenager speaking. It's like the voice of a 60-year-old, fiercely sarcastic French aristocrat.
Which immediately makes you wonder, is she lying? Is she possessed?
Or is her brain doing something so radically complex to protect itself that it took psychology decades to even begin to understand it?
Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we are looking at a really fascinating historical text that set out to analyze the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena.
Right, so we're looking past the spooky ghosts and spirits.
Exactly. If you look past the seances and the parlor tricks, what you are actually seeing are some of the earliest, rawest case studies of the human mind splitting itself apart to cope with extraordinary pressure.
Okay, let's unpack this. What actually happens when our minds enter a twilight state? Well, historically, doctors lumped these conditions under vague diagnoses, like hysteria or epilepsy or neurasthenia.
But these weren't just random neurological glitches, right?
Yeah.
Or like demonic possession.
Oh, not at all. The source material suggests these states might actually be the brain's radical attempt to manage extreme stress, or even construct a completely new identity from scratch.
What's fascinating here is that the author refuses to just wave away these occurrences. Things like table turning, spirit mediumship, or, severe sleepwalking.
Yeah, he doesn't just dismiss them as simple fraud. The text treats them as a legitimate window into the psychic shadow side of the human mind.
Right, like approaching a teenager claiming to speak to the dead not as a witch or a common con artist, but as this intricate psychological puzzle.
Exactly. But to really grasp how a mind can conjure a ghost, we need to establish a baseline. Like, how can the brain hallucinate a totally different reality while the body is technically still awake?
The text calls this a state of partial wakefulness. And, the case of Miss E provides a really heartbreaking look at this exact mechanism.
It really does. So Miss E was a 40-year-old bookkeeper, unmarried, living a very modest life, but carrying an unbearable amount of compounding stress.
Yeah, she had survived severe illnesses. Her hair had actually turned white almost overnight during a sickness.
Which is just a huge physical indicator of trauma.
And then she had just lost her fiancé to paralysis, like right before their wedding.
So her nervous system was entirely depleted. The severe exhaustion created a profound vulnerability in her.
She started having these moments at work, fugue states, basically.
Right. Her thoughts would simply halt. She would be walking down the street and snap back to reality in a completely different part of town.
With zero memory of the journey.
Exactly. The conscious executive part of her brain was shutting down to conserve energy, leaving her running on pure subconscious autopilot.
But the critical incident, the one that really illustrates this twilight state, it began with a completely ordinary walk through a local cemetery.
Yeah, she's walking through the cemetery and happens to see 3 young boys playing among the headstones.
There's absolutely nothing supernatural about it, just kids being kids.
But later that day, exhausted, she consumes a large dose of alcohol.
And she falls into a severe somnambulistic state, which is essentially a waking sleepwalk.
Right. And in this incredibly vulnerable state, she hallucinates a terrifying, immersive vision.
She sees skeletons rising from the earth, and she hears the muffled voices of children being buried alive.
It's horrific, but we have to look at the underlying mechanics of that hallucination. The sensory impressions she received during her walk, the graveyard, the children, they didn't just vanish.
Because her mind was in that vulnerable, semi-somnambulistic state.
Exactly. Those impressions sank into her subconscious and began operating independently. They formed their own psychological growths.
And the alcohol is a crucial factor here, right?
Oh, absolutely. It didn't invent the skeletons. It merely paralyzed her conscious, critical faculties.
So once the logical guardrails were down, her subconscious, which was overflowing with unprocessed grief from her fiancé's death, just broke through.
It broke through into her waking reality, distorting the mundane memory of boys playing into a nightmare of death and burial.
It's like the brain subconscious is an overzealous movie director. It takes random B-roll footage from your day kids in a graveyard and edits it into a blockbuster nightmare.
That is a great way to put it. Miss E shows us what happens when a mind spontaneously fractures under the weight of sheer trauma.
It's an involuntary nightmare. But what happens when you invite that fracture, when you treat the fragile edge of human consciousness like a parlor game?
Right, which brings us to the core case study of the text. A 15-and-a-half-year-old girl identified as S.W.
S.W. And her baseline character is described as pretty unpredictable.
Very unpredictable, highly distractible, and prone to extreme emotional fluctuations.
So in July of 1899, she and her friends decide to try table turning.
Just as a joke initially.
Yeah, and for anyone unfamiliar, table turning was essentially the Ouija board of its era. They used an overturned glass tumbler as a psychograph.
Right, everyone places their fingers lightly on the glass, and it supposedly glides across the table to spell out messages from the beyond.
They started doing this entirely as a joke. But almost immediately, S.W. becomes an incredibly adept medium.
It escalates rapidly, from just pushing a glass around to intense physical and psychological episodes.
She starts having what the text categorizes as little lapses, which were like brief fainting spells, and then these big attacks.
The big attacks were dramatic physical transformations. She would sink to the floor or slump into a chair, her muscles locking completely.
Becoming totally cataleptic.
Right. Her body would become rigid, she would turn deathly pale, and then she would begin speaking in entirely different voices, fully inhabiting the personas of the dead.
It's wild. To understand how a teenager slips into this state, the text introduces the concept of hysterical misreading.
Yes. S.W. exhibited a profound distractibility. For example, when she was asked to read a book aloud, her conscious attention would wander off to other thoughts.
But she would keep reading mechanically, unconsciously substituting local dialect slang for the actual written words on the page.
Without ever noticing her mistake, her brain's speech centers were totally decoupled from her conscious awareness.
It reminds me of highway hypnosis, where you drive for 20 miles and suddenly realize you don't remember any of it because you were lost in thought.
Exactly. Your brain knows the rules of the road well enough to run the driving program in the background.
And S.W.'s brain knew how to run the reading program in the background, but it was glitchy, pulling in her everyday slang.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, her consciousness was already highly compartmentalized, setting the perfect stage for a split personality.
Her mind was primed to run incredibly complex, autonomous programs in the darkness of her subconscious, while her main consciousness just checked out.
Which is exactly what happened during the seances.
Right. So since her mind is perfectly primed for a split, who exactly is stepping into the spotlight when she goes under?
The cast of characters she channels is staggeringly specific.
The two most prominent personalities could not be more polarized. First, there's the control spirit, who claims to be her deceased grandfather.
He is the most dry, tedious, conventional guardian figure imaginable.
Totally sanctimonious. He protects her during the trances, he prescribes cold compresses for her headaches when she wakes up, and he speaks in this hackneyed, unctuous poetry.
It's exactly the archetype a 15-year-old girl imagines when she thinks of a wise, protective elder.
But then, in stark contrast, there is Ulrich von Gervenstein.
Ah, Ulrich. He is vivacious, flamboyant, and deeply inappropriate by 1899 standards.
The text highlights his gay, hilarious nature. He actively flirts with the women in the room, makes pert remarks to the men.
And speaks High German with a highly exaggerated French accent.
Which is just, are we sure she isn't just acting? How does a 15-year-old generate this whole improvisational theater troupe in her head?
It's a fair question, and the source addresses that skepticism directly through the psychological concept of automatisms.
Meaning what, exactly?
S.W. wasn't consciously acting in the way a stage performer deliberately chooses their lines. Initially, her subconscious was answering the leading questions of the adults in the room.
Oh, through the table turning.
Right. Pure motor automatism. When you put your hand on a glass, micro-muscle movements occur without your conscious awareness, driven purely by expectation.
And then the glass moves.
Yes. Then an adult asks, is a spirit present? That verbal suggestion isolates a part of the speech area in her already compartmentalized brain.
But the true escalation, the shift from a moving glass to a full-blown alternate personality that happened during her second seance.
And the critical detail there is that darkness fell during the second experiment.
Right, they were in the dark.
That environmental shift is paramount. Darkness profoundly heightens suggestibility by stripping away the visual anchors of reality.
So her subconscious was already expressing itself through the motor movements.
But the darkness, combined with the adults' intense expectations, they really wanted a supernatural experience, it forced her unconscious to break through.
From purely motor movement into the visual sphere, meaning hallucinations.
Exactly. She stopped just twitching her fingers on a glass and started actively hallucinating the grandfather standing in the room.
Her brain served her a fully augmented reality based on the social pressures of the adults surrounding her.
She wasn't faking the vision. The split-off part of her personality objectified itself. The adults demanded a spirit, and her fractured subconscious provided one.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The personalities start out as external spirits, like the grandfather and Ulrich. But eventually, S.W. constructs a highly elaborate, idealized version of herself.
Yes, she turns that creative power inward. When she goes into the deepest trances, she becomes Ivan's.
Ivan's is her somnambulistic ego, and Ivan's is nothing like a moody, unstable teenager.
Not at all. She is a mature, dignified, black-haired Jewish woman in a turban.
She travels through the stars, she communes with the dead on equal footing.
And she develops an incredibly intricate mystical cosmology to support all of this.
Right, the mystic science. She invents these concepts. Magnosaur, which is a shiny white vapor from good spirits.
And its exact opposite, connoisseur, a black fuming fluid from dark spirits.
She's just inventing entirely new concepts of physics to explain the spiritual universe.
She claimed to be a Magnosaur medium, placing herself in the lineage of historical mystics. These sound like pseudo-scientific terms of the era, repurposed by a teenager trying to sound authoritative.
It's like a teenager's highly elaborate fan fiction of her own life.
It really is.
She is dreaming herself into an ideal state of virtue and perfection, anticipating who she wants to be in 20 years.
The author analyzes this through the lens of pathological daydreaming and intense autosuggestion.
What separates this from normal imagination, though?
Absolute immersion. S.W. isn't sitting there consciously lying to the researchers. She is entirely submerged in a dream role.
So it's an extreme form of a child getting lost in a game of make-believe.
Exactly, resulting in a total continuity of consciousness where she remembers these cosmic adventures when she wakes up, as if they were concrete memories.
The daydream calcifies into her reality.
Yeah.
But, all good performances must come to an end, right? What happens when the subconscious well runs dry?
There is a very steep, almost tragic decline in her psychic abilities. The profound mystical experiences began to fade.
The character of Ivines appeared less frequently, and Ulrich von Gerbenstein started taking over with childish chatter.
The psychological yield just grew meager. The internal pressure that created Ivines had vented.
And then comes the absolute crash. Eventually, S.W. was caught in flagranti. She was caught shooting.
Yes, hiding small objects in her dress to throw into the air in the dark to fake apports.
Basically faking that objects were magically materializing from the ether.
Right. Her genuine somnambulism had vanished, so she resorted to cheap parlor tricks to maintain the illusion.
Well, I have to push back here. If she was caught cheating at the end, throwing trinkets out of her pockets, doesn't that invalidate everything we just talked about? Was the whole thing a con from day one?
This raises an important question, and it's one the author tackles methodically. The transition from genuine somnambulism to conscious lying is actually a known gradient.
Oh, really?
Yes. We can't retroactively apply her conscious fraud at the end to the genuine psychological splitting at the beginning. As her genuine trances faded, she consciously faked them to maintain the attention she craved.
She was addicted to the reverence.
To understand why, we have to look at the teleological argument. Meaning, what was the ultimate purpose of this behavior?
Right.
These somnambulistic symptoms are incredibly common in puberty. An adolescent girl in 1899 had very little agency. S.W.'s trances were her future character violently trying to break through the difficulties of her current life.
It provided a psychological escape hatch, a way to practice being the mature, powerful woman she wanted to become.
Precisely, albeit in a highly pathological, dissociative way.
But to build that persona, her brain was vacuuming up material from everywhere, even utilizing information she didn't consciously know she possessed.
Yes. The author introduces a concept called cryptomnesia to explain this, meaning hidden memory.
And this explains the most supernatural elements of her seances, right? Like how S.W. knew random birthdays of dead people.
Yes. Highly specific facts she claimed to have never learned in her waking life. To the grieving adults in the room, it felt like undeniable proof she was talking to ghosts.
Because even S.W. herself believed it was a spirit whispering the information.
But cryptomnesia explains the neuroscience. Normally, when you learn a fact, your brain tags it with an ego attachment. I remember reading this.
Right.
S.W.'s subconscious absorbed these specific facts, maybe glancing at a family Bible years prior, without her conscious mind ever registering it.
The data was stored, but completely disconnected from her sense of self.
Exactly. When the memory surfaced during a trance, it lacked that ego tag. It felt alien to her. Her subconscious used these deeply buried facts to build her fantasy.
That is staggering. It completely shifts the perspective from is she lying or telling the truth to just marveling at the incredible labyrinthine lengths the human brain will go to in order to protect itself and grow.
It's a remarkable journey through the psychic shadow side.
We've gone from a teenager's parlor game to a fracturing of human consciousness to the invention of a cosmic alter ego. So what does this all mean for you listening at home?
Well, you might not be hallucinating spirits in a dark room.
Right. But think about the last time you spaced out while reading or had a vivid daydream about the confident, unflappable person you want to become in 10 years.
Every time you construct that idealized version of yourself in your head, your brain is utilizing a mild version of the exact same machinery S.W. used.
We all harbor a shadow side capable of immense creativity and immense self-deception.
We do. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawn directly from the text's conclusions about the teleological purpose of these states. If the somnambulism of a teenage girl is just her future, braver self trying to break through, consider historical figures like Joan of Arc.
Oh, wow.
Was her extraordinary courage and the voices that commanded her to lead armies just an extreme, historically weaponized version of the exact same teleological somnambulism we saw in a 15-year-old girl playing with an overturned glass?
It makes you wonder how much of human history was actually shaped by the subconscious mind staging a one-person play in the dark. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you look at that neat, clean map of the human mind, remember sometimes the boundaries just blur away entirely. Catch you next time.